Hello everyone, welcome to our channel that takes you on an exciting journey through real-life mysteries and stories solved in the most intriguing ways. If you're a fan of captivating narratives and tales that make you rethink the world around you, then you're in the right place. Don't forget to support us by liking and subscribing so you won't miss any of our new content. We're thrilled to share this special story with you today. Elizabeth Báthory, the legend of the Blood Countess and the most horrifying crimes in history. Elizabeth Báthory was born on August 7, 1560, into the noble Báthory family in the Kingdom of Hungary, which was part of the Austrian Empire at the time. Her mother, Anna Báthory, also came from a noble lineage, while her father, George Báthory, was from a prominent and wealthy Hungarian family. She grew up in an affluent and sophisticated environment, as her parents owned numerous castles and lands in Transylvania. From an early age, Elizabeth was raised differently from other children of her social class, receiving private education from specialized tutors in various fields. She learned Hungarian, Latin, and German, and developed exceptional social and political skills. It was expected that she would manage family affairs and properties effectively, qualities that distinguished noble families during that period. Elizabeth grew up in a world rife with political conspiracies among noble families, which significantly influenced her personality. She lived in her family's castles and was exposed to many political and social events in her youth that shaped her awareness and worldview. She knew how to maintain authority and influence in her environment and played an active role in family matters from a young age. In 1575, her marriage was arranged with Ferenc Nadasdy, a prominent Hungarian nobleman younger than her. This marriage was primarily political, aiming to strengthen alliances between noble families. After the wedding, Elizabeth moved to reside with her husband in the family's castles. However, Ferenc soon began experiencing health issues, which forced Elizabeth to take full responsibility for managing their vast estates and family affairs. Initially, their married life seemed to proceed smoothly, but over time, Ferenc Nadasdy began exhibiting symptoms of severe health problems. He fell seriously ill, affecting his ability to manage the family's affairs and properties. As a result, Elizabeth assumed more responsibilities and took charge of the family matters. As Ferenc's condition worsened, Elizabeth became increasingly influential in decision-making regarding their properties and political matters. This required her to address financial and administrative challenges. During this time, Elizabeth displayed remarkable organizational skills, focusing on maintaining the stability of her estates and safeguarding her family's interests. In 1604, Ferenc Nadasdy passed away after a prolonged illness. Following his death, Elizabeth inherited many of the family's properties, granting her greater power and influence. However, she faced numerous difficulties in maintaining these estates, especially amidst the political and economic challenges that Hungary was experiencing at the time. Ferenc Nadasdy's death marked a new chapter in Elizabeth's life, making her more independent in decision-making. Over time, her reputation among the community grew as a strong estate manager, elevating her status among Hungarian nobility. The negative aspects of Elizabeth Báthory's personality that led to her becoming monstrous began to manifest gradually after her husband's death in 1604. However, the causes that contributed to these traits stemmed from several social and psychological factors that had been accumulating throughout her life. One primary factor was the deep grief she experienced after her husband's death, as he was someone she had relied on heavily. After his passing, Elizabeth found herself alone in managing the family's vast properties and dealing with economic and financial challenges. Furthermore, she faced constant threats from political classes and nobles competing for power and influence, which made her feel the need to reinforce her authority by any means. But what most contributed to the emergence of her violent behavior was the combination of grief and loneliness with isolation from the outside world. Elizabeth was an ambitious individual, and as her psychological suffering deepened, a side of violence and vengeance began to emerge in her actions. The psychological and physical challenges she faced intensified, particularly in the later years of her life, as feelings of solitude and anxiety about losing more power and influence grew. Elizabeth maintained continuous contact with the servants and assistants in her castles and built a personal network of loyalty among them. Over time, doubts began to arise about how she treated these servants, as reports emerged of severe punishments and even torture. It is believed that her brutality became evident when her sense of detachment from reality grew. Servants were subjected to physical harm and severe penalties, and stories of young women being tortured and killed in her castles became infamous. These psychological and social factors accumulated to transform Elizabeth into a vengeful and violent figure, leading her to make painful decisions and commit heinous acts against those around her. First victim. The story of Elizabeth Báthory's first victim is one of the most famous accounts in her history. It revolves around a young girl named Anna, or Anna Callie. According to many historical narratives, Anna was a maid working in Elizabeth's castle in her early 20s. The story began when Elizabeth was in the midst of her psychological torment, living in deep isolation after her husband's death and feeling mounting pressure to maintain her power and authority amidst family and noble challenges. It is said that Elizabeth felt intense anger and jealousy toward the beauty and health of some of the young women working in her castle, which exacerbated her pathological feelings. Anna, known for her striking beauty and vitality, caught Elizabeth's attention. Some accounts suggest that Anna mistreated her mistress or perhaps ignored or refused certain orders, which Elizabeth perceived as an insult to her commanding personality. This incident might have been the spark that ignited Elizabeth's fury toward Anna. According to historical records, one cold night, Elizabeth summoned Anna to her private chamber in the castle. Moments later, Elizabeth told Anna that there was a way to enhance her beauty, leaving Anna surprised and confused. Elizabeth then started discussing unconventional methods of improving skin and youthfulness, giving Anna false hope. In reality, Elizabeth took Anna to a secluded room within the castle, where she subjected her to various forms of extreme cruelty. Methods of torture included burns inflicted by heated metal objects and electrocution. After several days of continuous torment, Anna succumbed to her injuries. It is said that Elizabeth derived a twisted sense of pleasure from Anna's suffering, as it reinforced her feeling of dominance and control. In popular and historical accounts, it is said that Elizabeth viewed this type of torture as a way to acquire eternal youth and beauty. During that time, there was a widespread belief that harming beautiful young women could grant strength and immortality. While some details vary across different accounts, Anna's death marked the beginning of a long series of atrocities committed by Elizabeth against many maids and young women in her castles. Second victim. The second victim in Elizabeth Báthory's story was a young girl named Catalin, a servant who had recently started working at the castle due to her desperate need for money to support her impoverished family. Catalin was known for her innocence and dedication to her work, but had no idea she would become a victim of the cruel lady of the castle. The story began when Elizabeth noticed that Catalin was a lively and youthful girl, full of energy. This triggered feelings of envy and resentment in Elizabeth, especially as she increasingly felt the effects of aging. It is believed that Catalin made a minor mistake while performing her duties, such as breaking a dish or spilling something. However, for Elizabeth, any mistake, no matter how trivial, was an excuse to unleash her pent-up anger. Elizabeth summoned Catalin to her private chamber, ostensibly to reprimand her for her mistake. When Catalin arrived, she faced an atmosphere charged with fear and intimidation. Elizabeth ordered her maids to prepare the room for punishment. The reprimand escalated quickly from verbal scolding to physical violence. According to accounts, the methods of torturing Catalin were even more brutal than those used on the first victim. Elizabeth used sharp metal tools to inflict deep wounds on the girl's body and forced her to stand still for hours in freezing conditions. At one point, it is said that Elizabeth made Catalin touch scalding hot objects, resulting in severe burns on her hands. After days of relentless torture, Catalin could barely stand or breathe. Eventually, she succumbed to her severe injuries and physical trauma. It is believed that Catalin's death was not merely a result of violence but also a manifestation of Elizabeth's deepening madness. What makes Catalin's story particularly tragic is how it highlighted the rapid escalation of Elizabeth's brutality. After the second victim's death, Elizabeth felt increasingly powerful and justified her actions as necessary or natural, paving the way for a series of atrocities that continued for years. The third victim, Elika, was a young girl who worked as a maid in Elizabeth Báthory's castle. She came from a poor family, and her work at the castle was seen as an opportunity to improve her living conditions and support her family. Elika was known for her kindness and hard work, but her life took a tragic turn when she fell under the mercy of the cruel mistress. The tragedy began when Elizabeth accused the girl of making a small mistake while carrying out her household duties, perhaps not cleaning one of the hallways to her satisfaction. Instead of rebuking her in the usual manner, Elizabeth found in this mistake an excuse to unleash her growing rage. Elika was summoned to an isolated room within the castle, where Elizabeth began to display her cruelty. The girl was forced to kneel for a long period while being humiliated and threatened. After that, Elizabeth began to use new methods of torture, allegedly setting a nearby stove alight, heating metal tools, and using them to inflict painful burns on the girl's body. Elizabeth also resorted to using sharp needles, slowly driving them into Elika's skin, savoring her reactions of pain and fear. She did not stop there but forced her to stand in physically painful positions for hours, causing her muscles to become terribly fatigued. After days of this brutal treatment, Elika had lost much of her physical and mental strength. Her body bore clear signs of torture, and she began to show symptoms of extreme weakness and emaciation. In the end, her body could no longer withstand any more, and she passed away. What makes Elika's story so heartbreaking is that her torture was not the result of any great crime, but a reflection of Elizabeth's madness and her descent into violent practices that became part of her character. After her death, her body was quietly disposed of, with no accountability, allowing Elizabeth to continue her cycle of violence without restraint. From a trusted maid to a victim. One of the intriguing stories in Elizabeth Báthory's life involves a maid who was close to her named Margaret. Margaret was different from the other maids. She was not just an ordinary servant but Elizabeth's personal assistant, accompanying her most of the time and carrying out her orders without hesitation. Due to her loyalty and blind obedience, she gained her mistress's trust, which granted her a special position in the castle. Margaret participated with Elizabeth in some of her cruel practices, helping her trap other maids or prepare torture tools. It is said that she initially viewed the violence as a way to please Elizabeth and maintain her privileged position in the castle. However, over time, she began to feel fear, especially when she noticed how Elizabeth did not hesitate to dispose of anyone, even those close to her. One day, Margaret made a small mistake while carrying out one of the tasks Elizabeth had given her. Perhaps she forgot to bring something Elizabeth had requested or was late in responding to an order. At first, she did not think this mistake would cost her much, given her closeness to her mistress. But Elizabeth, who was growing more violent and power-hungry, would not tolerate any mistake, no matter who made it. In a fit of rage, Elizabeth decided that Margaret was no longer trustworthy and should be punished to serve as an example to even the most loyal servants. She ordered her to be locked in one of the dark rooms in the castle, where she began to inflict the same kinds of torture that Margaret had helped carry out on others. The initial punishments included beating her violently with a metal rod, followed by forcing her to stand in cold water for long hours in one of the castle's cellars. Elizabeth escalated her cruelty by burning parts of Margaret's skin with hot wax. As Margaret begged for mercy, Elizabeth grew more vicious, believing that weakness had no place even among those who had been loyal to her. After days of relentless torment, Margaret could no longer endure the physical and mental torture and passed away. Her death was a shock to the other servants, who realized that their loyalty to Elizabeth would not protect them from her cruelty if she decided to target them. By killing Margaret, Elizabeth demonstrated that her madness and thirst for control had no boundaries and that she would not hesitate to turn even her closest allies into victims whenever she wished. The number of victims Elizabeth Báthory killed is not definitively known, but estimates range from 80 to more than 600 girls, based on investigations and testimonies. Her crimes were discovered when rumors began to spread in the area surrounding her castles about the disappearances of girls who worked for her or were brought in for training. Initially, the families of the poor girls were too afraid to speak out publicly due to Elizabeth's status and influence, but she later began targeting girls from noble families, which sparked considerable outrage and concern. The rumors reached their peak when one of the surviving girls escaped the castle and informed the authorities of the horrific torture and terrifying practices she had witnessed inside the palace. This led to the action of King Matthias II, who ordered Count Georgi Thurzo, the governor of the region and a relative of Elizabeth, to investigate the matter. In 1610, Georgi Thurzo led a group of soldiers to her castle in a surprise raid. Upon entering, they discovered horrifying scenes: the bodies of girls scattered around the castle, others dying from torture, and bloodstains spread across the torture rooms. The evidence was enough to confirm the rumors that had been circulating for years, leading to her arrest and house arrest, and starting the trials that revealed the details of her gruesome crimes. After the discovery of Elizabeth Báthory's crimes in 1610, King Matthias II and Count Georgi Thurzo moved forward with legal action. Elizabeth was arrested and placed under house arrest in the Cactus Castle, while her servants and accomplices, who had participated in the crimes, were also arrested for investigation and trial. In the following year, 1611, the official trials began, which were public and drew significant attention from both the public and nobility. 4 of Elizabeth's main servants were put on trial: Ilona Jew, Dorotea Sentes, Janos Ogverhiji, and Catalin Benetki. These assistants had been directly involved in carrying out the torture and killings, following Elizabeth's orders and helping her manage her crimes. During the trials, many witnesses gave their testimonies, including girls who survived the torture and the families of the victims. Terrifying details emerged about the methods of torture used by Elizabeth and her servants, such as burning, mutilation, and the use of sharp tools to inflict unbearable pain on the victims. Physical evidence was also found in the castle, including corpses, bloodstains, and torture rooms. The servants themselves confessed to much of the crimes during the investigations, either under pressure or due to their inability to escape the irrefutable evidence. As a result, most of them were sentenced to death. Ilona Jew and Dorotea Sentes were convicted and executed by being burned alive on the stake, a gruesome punishment reflecting the brutality of the crimes. As for Janos Ogverhiji, who had a less direct role, he was sentenced to be beheaded. It was clear that a public trial of Elizabeth could lead to a significant political scandal, as her family held considerable influence at the royal court and had close ties with many other noble families. The authorities feared that a public trial could destabilize the political situation and anger her allies. For this reason, it was decided to handle the matter cautiously. Closed trial sessions were held to officially convict Elizabeth without causing much public uproar. The evidence was carefully reviewed, and investigations proved that Elizabeth was responsible for torturing and killing a large number of girls. Instead of sentencing her to death, as had been done with her servants, a special decision was made to keep her under house arrest for life, as a way to punish her without stirring up public controversy. Elizabeth was transferred to her castle in Cactus, where stone walls were built to seal the windows and doors of her room completely. Only a small opening in the wall was left to pass food and water to her. This way, her total isolation from the outside world was ensured, preventing her from interacting with anyone. Elizabeth remained in this harsh isolation for 4 years. During this period, she had no means of communicating with the outside world, and she lived alone in a dark, silent room, surrounded by her memories and thoughts. Eventually, Elizabeth Báthory's physical and mental condition began to deteriorate significantly. This dark, harsh isolation served as a continuous punishment, as she lived in complete silence, far from any human interaction. In the last weeks of her life, reports emerged of her rapidly deteriorating health. It is said that she became pale and weak, barely able to move inside her small room. She suffered from emaciation due to a lack of activity and care, and perhaps hunger and isolation deeply affected her mental state. On one night in August 1614, Elizabeth fell seriously ill. She asked the guard responsible for bringing her food and water to call a doctor, but her request was ignored, as she was only allowed to interact with others for her basic needs. The next morning, when the guard came to deliver food, he heard no movement or response from inside the room. After several days with no signs of life, the guards decided to check on her. When they opened the small gap in the wall and looked inside, they found Elizabeth sitting on the floor, her body lifeless. Her death appeared to be peaceful, seemingly from natural causes, as there were no signs of violence or external interference. The authorities were notified of her death, and due to her noble status, Elizabeth Báthory was buried in her family's cemetery in the neighboring village. However, some accounts suggest that the villagers were uneasy about having her buried near them, which led to her remains being later moved to an unknown location. Her life, filled with bloodshed and terror, ended quietly, but her dark legacy continued to stir controversy and fear for centuries. After her death, her castles and properties became symbols of horror, with local families avoiding them for many years. Stories about her began to spread, transforming into terrifying legends, where many believed her actions were not entirely human but the result of an alliance with evil forces. These accounts were exaggerated, but they contributed to keeping her memory alive. Despite their significant influence, the Báthory family suffered from the stigma brought by Elizabeth's actions. Family members tried to distance themselves from her bad reputation and worked to rebuild their political and social standing. However, the name Elizabeth remained tied to unforgettable brutality, earning her titles such as Countess of Blood and Vampire, making her one of the most terrifying figures in history. Over the centuries, her story has been used in literature and art, inspiring novels and films that blend fact and fiction. While historians continue to debate the number of her victims and the reasons behind her actions, Elizabeth Báthory's legacy remains a lesson in the abuse of power and madness, embodied in its most extreme form. Her story ended with her death, but it left a lasting mark on European history, carved as one of its darkest and most horrifying chapters.